The world for 10-year-old Maya was painted in shades of gray. Not the gentle gray of a morning mist, but the hard, unforgiving gray of cracked pavement, chain-link fences, and the perpetual overcast sky that seemed to press down on her neighborhood like a heavy lid. Her life was a small one, lived in a second-floor apartment that always smelled of her grandmother's tired sighs and the lavender soap she used to wash their few clothes by hand. Maya was a whisper of a girl, with eyes that held the deep, quiet sorrow of an old soul and hands that were most comfortable holding either a book or a colored pencil. She had a universe inside her, one filled with vibrant, impossible colors, talking animals, and heroes who always arrived just in time. She would spend hours sketching them onto scraps of paper, creating worlds where kindness was the currency and courage was the law. But when she looked out her window, that universe dissolved into the harsh reality of her street. It was a place where kindness was seen as weakness and courage often got you hurt. Her grandmother, Elara, was a woman carved from resilience and worry. Her hands were gnarled from a lifetime of work, her back bent, but her love for Maya was a straight, unbending thing. She worked 2 jobs, cleaning offices late at night and serving coffee at a diner before the sun came up. The exhaustion lived in the deep lines around her eyes, a permanent resident in the house of her face. She saw the dimming light in her granddaughter's spirit and it broke her heart a little more each day. The source of that dimming light had a name. Kyle. He was 2 years older, bigger, with a casual cruelty that he wore as easily as his worn-out sneakers. He and his small pack of followers made the short walk to and from school a gauntlet of fear for Maya. They never hit her, not exactly. Their torment was more insidious. They would knock the books from her arms, scattering her paper universes into the gutter. They would whisper names that stuck to her skin like tar. They called her Ghost Girl because she was so quiet and pale with fear. Elara had tried to intervene. She had put on her one good church dress, her back straight with a mother's righteous fury, and marched into the principal's office. Mr. Henderson had listened with a practiced patience that was worse than outright dismissal. He was a man who saw children not as individuals but as paperwork. He steepled his fingers, looked over his glasses, and offered platitudes. Kids will be kids, Mrs. Wallace. Maya is a sensitive child, perhaps she should learn to be a bit more assertive. He had made it her fault. Her granddaughter's sensitivity was the problem, not Kyle's cruelty. Elara had left the office that day feeling smaller than when she went in, the fire in her belly reduced to a cold, bitter ash. The system, the one that was supposed to protect children, had locked its doors. They were alone. So Maya learned to make herself even smaller, to become more of a ghost. She would walk with her shoulders hunched, her eyes fixed on the cracks in the sidewalk, trying to become invisible. Her only sanctuary was a small, neglected park a block away from her school. Its swings were rusted, the slide was cracked, but it had a large, old oak tree whose sprawling roots created a perfect hiding place. She would sit there after school, clutching her worn teddy bear, Barnaby, and wait until she was sure Kyle and his friends were gone. Barnaby was her only link to her mother, a faded photograph of a memory. He was missing an eye and his fur was worn smooth in patches, but to Maya, he was a knight, a guardian. He held all the stories she was too scared to tell. One Tuesday, the gray sky wept a cold, persistent drizzle. The air was thick with the smell of wet asphalt and decay. Maya was huddled under the oak tree, the dampness seeping into her thin coat. She had just escaped another near confrontation with Kyle, her heart still hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. That was when she heard the sound. It wasn't the usual city noise. It was a ragged, angry cough, a metallic sputtering that ended with a final, defeated groan. She peeked around the massive trunk of the oak. A motorcycle, a monster of chrome and black metal, sat silent at the curb. And next to it stood a man who looked like he had been carved from the same material. He was huge. His shoulders were a wall of worn leather, his arms thick with intricate tattoos that snaked from his wrists to his neck. A thick, gray-streaked beard covered the lower half of his face, and his eyes, narrowed in frustration, were chips of cold steel. He kicked the front tire of the bike, a low growl rumbling in his chest. He looked like every monster from every storybook she had ever read. Maya shrank back behind the tree, pulling Barnaby tighter. She willed herself to be invisible, to merge with the bark and the shadows. The man pulled a greasy rag from a saddlebag and began tinkering with the engine, his curses quiet but potent. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The drizzle thickened. And then, she heard the one sound she dreaded more than any other. Laughter. Kyle's laughter. "Look what we found, boys," his voice cut through the damp air. "The ghost girl is talking to the trees." Maya's blood ran cold. She squeezed her eyes shut. Maybe if she didn't look, they weren't really there. But she could feel their presence, a circle of predatory energy closing in around her small sanctuary. "What you got there, ghost girl?" Kyle's shadow fell over her. "That stupid bear again." He lunged for Barnaby. Instinct took over. Maya clutched the bear to her chest, twisting away. "No. Leave him alone." Her voice was a pathetic squeak. The biker grunted, still focused on his engine. He hadn't noticed. He was in his own world of frustration and faulty mechanics. One of Kyle's friends grabbed her arm, while another pried at her fingers. She held on with all her might. This was not just a toy. This was a piece of her mother. It was everything. In the struggle, she lost her footing on the slick, muddy ground. She stumbled backward, out from the relative safety of the tree, and fell hard onto the pavement. A sharp pain shot through her wrist, but she barely felt it. Her grip had loosened. Barnaby flew from her hands, landing in a puddle near the curb. Kyle laughed, a triumphant, ugly sound. He walked over and placed his muddy sneaker on the bear's head, grinding it into the grimy water. Stupid bear for a stupid girl. Something inside Maya broke. Not a bone, but something far deeper. A sob, raw and ragged, tore from her throat. That was the sound that cut through the biker's concentration. It wasn't the drizzle, or the traffic, or Kyle's taunts. It was the sound of pure, helpless despair. He lifted his head slowly. His steel chip eyes scanned the scene, the smirking bullies, the girl on the ground, the teddy bear being crushed in the mud. He didn't move for a long second. He just watched, his expression unreadable. Then he wiped his greasy hands on his jeans, the movement deliberate and unervingly calm. He stood up. And he was even bigger than Maya had thought. He was a mountain of a man, and his shadow fell over all of them. He didn't speak. He just took one slow step toward them. Kyle's smirk faltered. The other boys shuffled their feet, their bravado evaporating like mist. The biker's eyes were locked on Kyle, and they held a look of such profound, ancient disappointment that it was more terrifying than any rage. He took another step. Kyle snatched his foot off the bear as if it were on fire. "We were just playing," he stammered, his voice suddenly high and thin. The biker said nothing. He just kept looking at him. "Let's go," one of the other boys whispered, already backing away. They didn't need to be told twice. They scattered like roaches in the light, leaving Kyle alone for a split second before he too turned and ran, not even looking back. Silence descended on the park, broken only by the patter of the rain and Maya's quiet, hitching sobs. The giant man walked to the puddle and bent down. His large, tattooed fingers, which had just been wrestling with steel and grease, were surprisingly gentle as he picked up the soaked and muddied teddy bear. He squeezed some of the water from it and walked over to Maya, who was still on the cold, wet ground. He knelt, a difficult task for a man his size, bringing him down to her level. He held out the bear. His face was still stern, etched with hard lines from years of wind and sun, but the steel in his eyes had melted into something softer. Concern. "This belonged to you, little one." His voice was a low rumble, like gravel being poured onto a road. Maya nodded, reaching out with a trembling hand to take Barnaby back. She hugged the wet bear to her chest, burying her face in its damp fur. "Thank you," she whispered. "You hurt?" he asked, his eyes flicking to her wrist, which she was cradling against her body. She shook her head, a lie. All she could think about was the kindness of this terrifying man. He had saved Barnaby. He had saved her. She felt an overwhelming urge to give him something in return, to balance the scales. But she had nothing. Nothing except. She fumbled in her coat pocket with her good hand and pulled out her only treasure for the day, a small chocolate bar, slightly squashed. She had been saving it. She held it out to him. "For you," she said, her voice barely audible. "My grandma says when you can help, you help. And when someone helps you, you say thank you." The biker stared at the small, offering hand. He looked from the chocolate bar to her earnest, tear-streaked face. For a moment, he seemed completely frozen. A dozen emotions flickered across his rugged features: surprise, confusion, and something else, something that looked almost like pain. Slowly, he reached out and took the chocolate bar. His fingers dwarfed it. He peeled back the wrapper with a surprising delicacy and broke off a tiny piece. He put it in his mouth, chewing slowly as if it were the most important meal he had ever eaten. "Thank you," he rumbled. "What's your name?" "Maya, I'm Grizz," he said. He nodded once, a gesture of profound respect. Then he stood, walked back to his bike, and with one final, mighty kick, the engine roared to life, a triumphant thunder that echoed through the gray streets. He swung his leg over, gave her one last look, and then he was gone, a fading storm of noise and power. The following week, the world grew grayer. Grizz's brief appearance felt like a dream, a strange and powerful hallucination. The reality was Kyle's simmering rage. He had been humiliated, and his cruelty, now sharpened by vengeance, sought a target. He and his friends found Maya on the school playground 2 days later. There were no words this time, no taunts. Just a coordinated, vicious shove as she climbed the metal ladder to the slide. Her hand slipped. She fell. The world spun in a nauseating blur of gray sky and brown wood chips, and then came a sound. A sickening, cracking sound that seemed to come from inside her own body. Then, white-hot, blinding pain. And then, mercifully, darkness. She woke up in a hospital bed. The world was no longer gray, it was a sterile, unforgiving white. The smell of antiseptic burned her nose. Both of her legs were encased in heavy, white casts, propped up on a pile of pillows. They felt like alien things, heavy and dead. Her grandmother was beside her, holding her hand, her face a crumpled mask of grief and fury. The school was calling it an accident. An unfortunate tumble. There were no witnesses, they said. No one saw anything. Another door slammed shut by the system. The medical bills were already piling up, a mountain of paper that represented a future of impossible debt for Elara. Maya felt a despair so profound it was almost peaceful. It was a cold, heavy blanket that smothered every other feeling. The kindness she had shown the biker, the small gift of chocolate, it had been meaningless. A foolish gesture in a world that only rewarded cruelty. She had tried to be good, and this was her reward. 2 broken legs and her grandmother's heart breaking beside her. There were no heroes. Not in her world. A few days later, a strange thing happened. It began as a feeling more than a sound, a faint vibration in the floor of her hospital room. It grew steadily, a low thrumming that buzzed up through the legs of her bed. Then it became a sound, a deep, guttural rumble that seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. Nurses paused in the hallway, their heads cocked. Elara went to the window, her brow furrowed with confusion. What in the world is that noise? The rumble swelled, growing louder and louder until it was a deafening, ground-shaking thunder. The window panes rattled in their frames. Car alarms in the parking lot began to shriek in protest. It was the sound of an earthquake, of a military invasion, of a gathering storm of immense power. Elara gasped. Maya, pushing herself up on her elbows, could see her grandmother's reflection in the glass, her eyes wide with disbelief. Outside, the hospital parking lot was being swallowed by a river. A river of chrome and steel and black leather. Motorcycles. Not a dozen. Not 50. Hundreds. 1,000. They poured in from every entrance, an army on wheels, moving with a silent, disciplined precision that was utterly terrifying. They filled every parking space, then the aisles, then the grassy verges, until the entire landscape around the hospital was a sea of polished metal and sleeping engines. The thunder ceased as they cut their engines in unison, plunging the world into a shocking, profound silence. Hospital security guards stood frozen, their radios squawking uselessly. Patients and staff crowded the windows on every floor, their faces pale with a mixture of fear and awe. Who were they? What did they want? Then, from the center of the silent army, a single figure dismounted. The mountain of a man. Grizz. He walked toward the hospital entrance, his boots clicking on the pavement with an unnerving rhythm. The crowd of bikers parted for him like the Red Sea. He didn't look left or right. His purpose was singular, his destination absolute. He entered the hospital lobby, and a wave of silence rippled before him. The terrified receptionist looked up at him, her mouth agape. "I'm here to see Maya Wallace," he rumbled, his voice calm but carrying the weight of the 1,000 men at his back. Moments later, the door to Maya's room swung open. Grizz filled the doorway, his massive frame blocking out the light from the hall. Behind him stood 2 other bikers, equally imposing. Elara instinctively moved to stand between him and Maya's bed, a small, frail shield against a titan. Grizz's eyes found Maya. He ignored everyone and everything else in the room. He walked slowly to her bedside, his heavy boots making no sound on the linoleum floor. He looked down at her small frame lost in the big bed, at the 2 pristine white casts that entombed her legs. Maya looked up at the giant, her heart fluttering with a feeling that was no longer fear. It was a fragile, budding hope. Her voice was a small, broken whisper, but it carried across the silent room. "My legs are broken," a muscle twitched in Grizz's jaw. The hard lines of his face seemed to deepen, but his eyes softened with a look of profound, aching regret. He reached out, not to her, but to her grandmother. He pressed a thick, heavy envelope into Elara's trembling hand. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he seemed to be fighting to control. "My club, the Iron Guardians, we have a code. We protect our own. And we repay our debts." He looked back at Maya. "Your granddaughter showed me kindness when she had every reason not to. She paid me for my help with the only thing she had. That makes her one of us. That makes her family." Elara opened the envelope. It was filled with cash. More money than she had seen in her entire life. I can't take this," she stammered. "It's not a gift," Grizz said firmly. "It's a payment. Paid in full. For the hospital. For your lost wages. For a new start. For whatever she needs. There's a bank account set up in her name, too. She won't ever have to worry about money again." He then turned his attention back to Maya, kneeling beside her bed. "We heard what happened," he said, his voice lowering to a conspiratorial growl. "That accident," he spat the word out like it was poison. "That principal, Mr. Henderson. He doesn't work at the school anymore. One of my brothers is a lawyer. A very persuasive lawyer. The school board suddenly found a great deal of motivation to do the right thing. There's a new principal starting Monday," he continued, "and the boy. Kyle. He and his family had a long talk with a few of my chapter presidents. They understand now. They understand the consequences of their actions. He won't be bothering you again. He won't be bothering anyone again." The threat was unspoken but absolute. It hung in the air, a shield of pure intimidation forged for her protection. Over the next few days, the hospital room was transformed. It was filled with flowers, giant stuffed animals, and more books and art supplies than Maya could ever have dreamed of. Bikers, in their leather vests adorned with the Iron Guardians patch, stood quiet guard in the hallway, their presence a silent declaration that this room, and the little girl within it, were under their protection. The hospital staff, initially terrified, now treated Maya like royalty, their fear replaced by a hushed respect. The Iron Guardians didn't stop there. One Saturday, a convoy of pickup trucks and flatbeds, escorted by 50 bikers, rolled into Maya's neighborhood. They descended on the neglected park. They tore out the rusted swings and the cracked slide. They laid fresh sod, planted flower beds, and installed brand new, brightly colored playground equipment. By sunset, the gray, forgotten space had been reborn into a vibrant oasis of color and hope. They even mounted a small, bronze plaque on the new bench under the old oak tree. It read, Maya's Park. Protected by the Iron Guardians, when the day came for Maya to leave the hospital, her legs still in casts but her spirit already healed, the entire club was there. They formed two silent, respectful lines from the hospital entrance to a brand new, specially modified van they had purchased for her and her grandmother. Grizz himself pushed her wheelchair. As they drove away, back to their apartment, which had also been secretly repaired and furnished by the Guardians, Maya looked out the back window. 1,000 men on 1,000 motorcycles sat in the parking lot, their helmets off, holding them over their hearts. They didn't leave until her van was out of sight. Maya was no longer the ghost girl. She was a girl with 1,000 guardian angels who wore leather instead of wings and rode steeds of chrome and steel. She learned that a hero doesn't always look like the pictures in her books. Sometimes, a hero is a mountain of a man with a gravelly voice and eyes that see the value in a small, broken piece of chocolate. She learned that kindness is not a weakness, but a seed. And if planted in the right soil, it could grow into a forest of protection, a fortress of love, strong enough to hold back all the gray in the world.